Hi, I'm Dr. Jeremy Neal, and I'm a professor of philosophy at Houston Baptist University. I want to talk today about Alasdair MacIntyre, one of the most influential philosophers of the last 20 or 30 years or so, and especially about his critique of modern moral philosophy. So MacIntyre is very pessimistic about modern moral philosophy. He is a Scottish immigrant who has spent most of his career in the United States. And he thinks that modern moral philosophy, in fact, is indicative of a great confusion or chaos or collapse that has occurred in the way in which we think about morality and human behavior and social ethics. So MacIntyre, in his great book After Virtue, describes in the second chapter several different examples of ways in which modern moral philosophy and the discourse with which we talk about human behavior has fallen into disrepair. Among these examples are things like distributive justice, where MacIntyre cites diverse views like Rawls's and Nozick's views. Also abortion, where MacIntyre cites views as diverse as Aquinas's views, Kant's views that arise out of the liberal Enlightenment, and also just war, where MacIntyre cites several different views ranging from Augustine to Clausewitz to Realpolitik and so forth. The point of these examples is that MacIntyre thinks that modern moral philosophy is a chaotic and destructive endeavor in which the different parties participating in it have inherited a series of terms which they no longer understand because these terms no longer have a common meaning which all of the parties participating in the moral conversation are privy to. So MacIntyre thinks that it's not possible within this milieu of chaos and destruction for modern moral philosophers to be able to dialogue with each other in a constructive way about proper human behavior, because the very terms that they are using reference concepts that are diverse and mean different things and have little intelligibility or commensurability across the different gaps, conceptual gaps that the philosophers employing these terms are operating on. So MacIntyre, then, being so pessimistic about modern moral philosophy, thinks that there's not much that can be done in the wake of the disaster that he thinks has taken place in the last several centuries. He thinks that the disaster is historically founded. He thinks that it has arisen out of a particular set of historical constraints which are characteristic of the Enlightenment. So during the Enlightenment, philosophers for the first time sought to ground morality not in an understanding of human teleology as they did for many centuries in the Aristotelian tradition, but rather they sought to ground morality in some rational foundation. And MacIntyre thinks that the failed efforts in his view, of a number of philosophers to ground morality in this rational foundation has resulted in our own subjectivist moral age, in which there is no common vocabulary by means of which we can commensurate across the different moral assertions that are made. So as a final articulation of the history in the 20th century, MacIntyre references views of emotivists, and before them, views of intuitionists. So the emotivists, according to MacIntyre, are philosophers who think that that which makes something morally right is the preference of the person who is asserting the moral claim. And MacIntyre thinks that this is the tail end of the collapse of the moral tradition in the West. An emotivist would say, I think that action X, Y, Z is right. and someone might ask him, why is it right? And the emotivist would say, well, because it's what I prefer. So the emotivist thinks that there is nothing outside of the individual, nothing larger than the individual that the individual can reference as a way of grounding his moral claims, because the individual is himself a grounding for his moral claims. He is the end-all and be-all grounding for his moral claims, and his preferences ought to take precedent over any other consideration. So in MacIntyre's historical story, it is the emotivist view, which he thinks is the dominant moral opinion of our age, and it is the view which he thinks has inherited the collapse of the Western moral tradition.